Hey guys, tonight's journey begins in a world where laughter was a currency, and the cost of a misstep could be your life. The man we follow wore bells, but he was no hero. He was a jester, a fool not by choice, but by fate. Before you settle in, adjust the lights, let the gentle hum of a fan lull you into quiet, and remember this isn't just a story about jokes. It's about what it meant to survive by making others laugh when your own soul had forgotten how. No one aspired to become a jester. It wasn't a dream children whispered about by firelight, nor a path carved by apprenticeship or will. It was more like an accident. You became one because someone powerful looked at you and saw something odd, amusing, or different, a limp, a lisp, a clever retort at the wrong time, and decided you would serve them by being ridiculous. One moment you were a commoner with a bad back or a sharp tongue, and the next you were being handed a patchwork costume and told that henceforth you were the court's entertainment. Forever. Some fools were snatched up like curiosities, passed between noble houses like talking pets or painted birds. Others ended up in court after accidentally amusing a baron at a banquet. Perhaps you slipped in goose fat and landed in a way that made someone snort into their wine. That was enough. They'd fetch you from your cottage the next day, fit you with a hat adorned with bells, and tell you to never stop being funny again. From then on, your body, your voice, your strangeness, it was all property of the crown. You were displayed like a living ornament, expected to prance through political meetings, distract foreign dignitaries, and inject humor into tense negotiations. You weren't allowed to decline. Refusal meant suspicion, and suspicion in a medieval court meant dungeons, not second chances. It was a strange sort of captivity. You weren't shackled, not visibly, but you were no freer than the kitchen dog. A jester without jokes was a liability. Without laughter, you were just another man with nothing to offer and no land to claim. A walking arrest warrant in a society that jailed the idle for daring to exist. So you performed, even when you weren't summoned. The court was a stage without curtains. There were no rehearsals, no breaks. You were always in costume, always expected to twirl or insult or fall over at just the right moment. You learned quickly that silence was dangerous and seriousness was worse. Frowning could be mistaken for plotting. Stillness meant you were broken. If you weren't performing, you were being watched and judged for not performing. You lived at the center of it all, but always alone. Not one of the nobles, never really one of the servants. You were visible but untouchable, a mascot, a noise in a noisy place, a person flattened into caricature. You dined last, slept in the shadows of banquet halls, and wore the scraps that others deemed too ridiculous even for hunting dogs. But above all, you endured, because the alternative was unthinkable. Every day your body was a stage and your face a mask, even when it wasn't. The costume, bright, clashing colors, motley patterns stitched together with no sense of dignity or design, was a signal. It told the room before you even opened your mouth that you were not to be taken seriously. The hat, that absurd crown with floppy horns and tinkling bells, wasn't made to flatter. It was designed to humiliate, to ensure your entrance was always a performance. They wanted to hear you coming, like a wind chime of mockery echoing down stone corridors. Your shoes curled at the ends like a goblin's. Your belt knotted in a way that made it impossible to carry anything useful. You were dressed like a walking joke, because the court needed to be reminded you were beneath them. Not just in status, in spirit. Even your place in the palace was a contradiction. You lived under the same roof as dukes and counts, dined, eventually, on the scraps from their tables. You were there during every feast, every wedding, every royal argument, but you were never invited. You were orbiting the elite like a jester moon, never quite touching the light. The nobles didn't confide in you. The servants didn't trust you. You were too odd for one group, too close to power for the other, suspended, tolerated, alone. And still, every time someone's mood darkened, every time a hunting trip failed or a cousin died or a foreign diplomat insulted the king's beard, it was your door they knocked on. You'd be yanked from your bed or from your floor mat behind the kitchens and told simply, make him laugh. It didn't matter what had happened to you that day, or whether you were well or rested or grieving something of your own. Your job wasn't to be, it was to amuse. Somewhere along the way, you lost track of who you were before all this. Before the bells, before the fake smile you learned to wear so perfectly it started to feel like your face. Because there was no off switch. The jokes didn't stop. The pressure didn't pause. You weren't allowed moods. You weren't allowed to be human. Your emotions were reduced to a repertoire, happy, louder happy, and dancing. Even when no one had summoned you, you felt the weight of their expectations. Walking through the corridors, you knew to strut. Past the queen's table, do something clever, a nod, a twirl. Sit quietly in a corner for too long and someone would point and whisper, "Why isn't the fool performing?" And if your smile faltered, if your eyes betrayed a shadow of thought or fatigue, the room would shift. Because in the medieval court, a jester with feelings was not entertaining. He was suspicious. Worse than being dismissed was being noticed for the wrong reasons. A too clever quip. A satire that landed just a little too truthfully. A joke that didn't quite hide its edge. You walked a narrow line every day, the knife edge between mockery and offense, entertainment and insubordination. Cross it and you could lose your place, or your tongue, or your life. And the line moved. One day a noble might laugh at your impression of his gout. The next he'd call it treason. The queen might giggle at a dig about her cousin's drinking, but if that cousin was sitting beside her tomorrow, it became a scandal. You could never be sure which joke would be your last, but you kept going, because you had to. There was no applause, only survival. The audience before you was composed of kings and counts, dukes and duchesses, powerful figures who wielded influence with a glance and punishment with a nod. You didn't entertain them because you loved it. You entertained them because your life depended on it. And the stakes were never clear, never fixed. One misstep, one ill-timed jest, and the same lords who once howled with laughter could have you whipped or cast out. Or worse. You see, there were no second chances. No sympathetic HR department. If you failed to amuse on the wrong day, your next role might involve chamber pots or chains. The court could be ruthless. And you were the one soul in the room, not allowed to be serious. Everyone else could rage, mourn, plot, or pout. But you danced through tantrums, giggled through crises, tiptoed around treason with a painted smile. Your very being was a distraction from the state's worst moods. Even when tragedy struck, when the queen miscarried, when the enemy breached the border, when the heir fell ill, you were still expected to juggle, joke, and pretend it all meant nothing. The court needed you to pretend, because no one else could. Your forced laughter, your ridiculous hat, became the safety valve of an entire system built on tension and fear. As long as the fool kept smiling, maybe everything was still under control. But the cost was personal. Your identity dissolved into the role. You were expected to be funny at all hours, through all seasons of grief or joy. There were no quiet days, no retreat, no room to just be. You didn't get to have a headache or heartbreak. The demands were endless. Nobles wanted novelty. The same clever pun couldn't be used twice. That witty satire, great. Now write 10 more before breakfast. Then perform them, impersonate 3 barons, lampoon a bishop, and slip on a goose feather like you meant it. And if you didn't deliver, you'd know. Not through a bad review, but through scorn, slaps, or silence so cutting it could bleed. Sometimes you'd be pelted with scraps. Sometimes you'd be dragged from the hall. And sometimes you'd be replaced without warning. Another oddity brought in to wear your bells, your grin, your life. Because nothing about your position was secure. The room you amuse today might expel you tomorrow. A single misplaced jest could transform you from favorite to offender. A joke too sharp, too truthful, too personal, and suddenly you weren't the jester anymore. You were a traitor in disguise. And the irony. The court gave you permission to mock kings, clergy, even foreign guests. But only if you did so in riddles, in metaphors, in ways so layered they could be dismissed as nonsense if needed. You learned to speak truths while pretending to say nothing, to hide daggers in double meanings, to coat critiques in feathers and laughter. But if the mood shifted, if the bishop scowled, or the baron took offense, then your clever wordplay became evidence. Your license to jest became a rope. Because no matter how sharp your tongue, your neck was always on the line, and there was no one to protect you. You weren't noble. You weren't clergy. You weren't even quite human in their eyes, just a decoration with opinions. A fool whose usefulness could expire the moment his truth outshone his jokes. Before you even speak, the room is already laughing, not at your wit, but at your presence. Your very outfit, the clashing colors, the absurd hat, the bells, it announces you before your voice ever reaches the rafters. You are a caricature made flesh, a walking parody of yourself. You enter not as a man but as a signal. Amusement is here. Now everyone waits to be entertained. That hat, known as the coxcomb, isn't simply a costume. It's a cage woven in wool. Its flopping horns and jingling tips are reminders that your dignity has been repurposed for delight. Your tunic, a disaster of color and cloth, is designed to offend the senses. Red against yellow, blue colliding with green, stitched together not with taste but with mockery. No tailor would dare craft it for beauty. It exists to shout that you are the lowest in the room, the designated clown. The nobles wear silk and velvet embroidered with gold. You wear burlap dyed in shrieking tones. They glide. You trip. They whisper, you cackle. You're not allowed to be elegant. Your every motion is supposed to remind them that you are ridiculous, so they don't have to feel that way themselves. Even your shoes are jokes. Long-nosed slippers with bells stitched into the curls, perfect for catching on rugs or slipping on spilled wine. Your belt, useless. Oversized, twisted into knots for show, not function. If you needed to carry anything of value, a knife, a pouch, a piece of bread, too bad. Your hands are for juggling. Your back is for bending. You don't need tools. You are the tool. There is no alternate outfit for state dinners or somber occasions. You wear this same buffoonish skin at weddings, at funerals, during political summits and religious masses. Your body is not your own. It is property of the spectacle. And yet somehow, despite it all, despite the clothing and the ridicule and the stench of mockery, you know everything. You hear things, see things. Because while the nobles ignore you, while they insult your appearance and toss chicken bones at your feet, they forget that you are always there, always watching, always listening. You learn who hates whom, who's in debt, who sleeps where, who plans what. Secrets swirl through the air, and you collect them like a child picking up pebbles at the riverbank. You store them, turn them into riddles, into jests, into warnings wrapped in laughter. You may live in a broom closet behind the kitchens, but your knowledge can shift a kingdom, and everyone knows it. That's why the nobles never quite trust you, why the servants lower their voices when you pass, why the guards never stop watching. They all sense it, that beneath the bells and the grin you're dangerous. Not because you wield a sword, but because you wield something subtler, something sharper. You know things. And in a world ruled by secrets, knowledge is the deadliest weapon of all. Every feast was a performance, and you were the centerpiece of the humiliation. The long banquet tables, laden with roasted meats and dripping candles, weren't merely about celebration. They were arenas, and you, the jester, were the game everyone was allowed to win. As guests arrived, flushed from drink or eager for spectacle, their eyes landed on you like a spark seeking dry timber. A joke, fool. A trick. Imitate the Duke's limp. Mock the bishop's sermon. Make us laugh not because you're clever, but because we demand it. You didn't perform from joy. You did it because the air was thick with expectation. Because every failed jest, every hesitated gesture, threatened to tilt the mood of powerful people toward cruelty. Nobles couldn't insult each other directly, too risky, too political. But you were fair game. A punching bag with bells. They could pull your hat over your eyes, demand you grunt like a pig, throw bones at your feet and laugh as you scrambled to stay upright. And you did, because the alternative was silence. And silence in court was never peaceful. It was a warning, a shift in tension, a sign that someone was about to be humiliated, exiled, or executed. You filled the silences with noise, with absurdity, with desperation masquerading as joy. You juggled tension. You swallowed the room's unease and spit it back out as humor. But when the last goblet was drained and the guests stumbled off to silk-sheeted beds, your night didn't end. You returned to your tiny corner behind the kitchens, alone, bruised, aching in the ribs from a thrown turkey leg or a drunken slap. You curled up in your threadbare blanket and stared at the darkness, still hearing the laughter you had forced, wondering if tomorrow they would still want you. Or if someone younger, weirder, louder would be offered your bells, because you weren't just there for entertainment. You were insurance, a buffer between the powerful and their own worst instincts. They laughed at you to avoid looking at each other. Your humiliation was a sacrifice, one made daily, without consent, without relief. And they didn't even know your name. To them you were the noise, a sound in the background of memory, replaceable, disposable. By daylight, you were the fool, dancing, juggling, absorbing ridicule like armor. But by night, you became something far more dangerous. The bells on your hat might have quieted, but your mind did not. In the stillness after the feasts, when the nobles staggered back to their chambers, bloated and flushed, you remained awake, alert, listening. Because the truth was, you were always listening. The jester, for all his absurdity, had a strange kind of power. You were invisible in the most ironic way, always seen, yet never considered. Nobles spoke freely around you as if you were furniture. Servants forgot you were even present, even as they whispered secrets while you stood a few steps away holding a platter or pouring wine. And those secrets, you gathered them like coins, polished them in your mind, sorted the dangerous from the useful. You learned who slept with whom, who plotted against whom, which lord smuggled favors to foreign envoys, and which bishop took bribes behind veils of incense. You knew of treasons barely whispered, of jealousies left to simmer, of grudges soaked in wine and left fermenting for months. And you remembered everything, not because you wanted to, but because your survival often depended on it. Sometimes the king would summon you privately, not for amusement but for truth. He'd sip from a jeweled cup and murmur, "Fool, what did the Frenchman whisper to the bishop last night?" And you had to answer. Not too quickly, that would seem rehearsed. Not too slowly, that would smell of evasion. Just right. Clever, veiled, but clear. Because if you didn't answer, you were hiding something. And if you answered too well, he might begin to suspect your loyalties. It was a terrifying game, one you could never win. The monarch needed your honesty, but feared your insight. You were the only one allowed to speak the truth. And yet, if that truth struck too close to the heart of power, it could kill you. So you crafted your answers like riddles, delivered them like jokes, couched your meanings in metaphors and mimed foolishness while your mind worked like a knife. And you weren't the only one who knew it. The nobles watched you warily. The servants stopped talking when your shadow passed. The guards regarded you with the same suspicion they gave to cloaked strangers at the castle gates. Because everyone understood at some level that the fool, for all his jests, was dangerous. That your greatest weapon wasn't your voice or your jokes, but the simple, devastating truth you carried. Because in a court soaked with lies and masks, you were the mirror. A cracked one, yes, but a mirror all the same. In a castle of stone and smoke, your job was to keep the laughter flowing, even when your own heart was splintering. It didn't matter that your dog had died the night before or that fever gripped your bones. The queen still expected you to mock her cousin's ridiculous wig. The duke still needed to be entertained after his favorite hawk flew off and never returned. No one paused to ask how you were feeling, because your feelings weren't part of your purpose. If you wept, they called it insubordination. If you hesitated, it was laziness. If you looked tired, they assumed you were becoming useless. Sadness made people uncomfortable. Anger made them afraid. Even silence was suspicious. Your emotional palette was allowed only one color: absurdity, and you wore it every day like a mask glued to your face. Some nights, you performed while sick, a sheen of sweat betraying the fever behind your forced smile. Sometimes you danced while your stomach churned with grief. You'd lost someone, perhaps a brother to a plague or a friend to war, and yet you still had to caper and joke while nobles threw breadcrumbs and insults. There was no curtain to retreat behind, no privacy to collapse into. You lived in the open, under the gaze of those who had forgotten long ago that you were anything more than noise and fabric. And if by some cruel twist they noticed your pain, they wouldn't offer sympathy. Instead, they'd cock their heads and ask, "What's wrong with the fool today?" Or worse, they'd joke about replacing you. "Perhaps the jester's broken," someone might mutter over venison. "Shall we find another?" And just like that, your humanity became a punchline. So you learned. You learned to weaponize your pain before they could. You turned heartbreak into parody. You took the lump in your throat and transformed it into a pratfall. You laughed first and louder, so they couldn't beat you to it. You wrapped your sorrow in irony and made it a performance. Because to let them see the cracks, to let them see that beneath the bells was a soul just trying to hold itself together, would be to destroy the illusion. And without the illusion, you had no role, no safety. The cruelest part was this: the better you performed your pain, the less they suspected it was real. The louder your laugh, the more they believed you were content. You were the only person in the court who wasn't allowed to fall apart, even when you were dying inside. Because you weren't there to feel. You were there to make everyone else forget what feeling felt like. When kings awoke angry, the court held its breath. A bad dream, a spoiled roast, a thundercloud mood settling into royal brows, it could mean disaster for everyone. And in that delicate, shifting atmosphere, all eyes turned to you. You, the fool, were expected to fix what no one else dared name. If the monarch wasn't smiling, clearly you weren't doing your job. It didn't matter that you had just performed at last night's banquet until your voice cracked, that you danced until your ankles throbbed, or that your clever satire had brought laughs from half the court. None of that carried forward. The king's mood reset the world, and you were the first to be blamed when it soured. You were not just a jester. You were the emotional scapegoat of the realm. If a diplomatic meeting went poorly, the steward might mutter, "Perhaps the fool failed to set the tone." If the queen's temper flared, someone might whisper that your joke had missed its mark. If the prince sulked, if the bishop frowned, if the dog barked at shadows, somehow it was your fault. Because laughter was the balm that kept the court from tearing itself apart, and you were expected to supply it endlessly. Sometimes the pressure came as a sneer, sometimes a command. "Entertain me," the king might say, wine in hand and menace in his voice. "I'm in no mood, and that had better change." And they weren't joking. You were one misplaced pun away from being demoted to scrubbing flagstones or, on a truly grim day, executed for simply failing to amuse. One silence too long, one joke too bitter, and you go from jester to liability in the space of a heartbeat. And the most brutal truth, no one would thank you when it worked. If the king's scowl softened, it was because his wine was well aged. If laughter returned to the hall, it was credited to the weather, the music, or divine grace, never to you. Your success was invisible, your failure unforgettable. You lived on a tightrope stretched across a pit of royal moods, and the wind never stopped blowing. So you danced harder, spoke quicker, hid your own despair behind ever larger performances. You became the kingdom's thermostat, adjusting your temperature to keep everyone else comfortable. But there was no warmth for you, only the constant demand to burn brightly, regardless of whether anything was left to fuel the fire. You may have lived within the castle walls, eaten beneath the same chandeliers that shimmered above kings, worn bells that echoed through royal corridors, but you were never free. Not really, not even close. Your life as a court jester wasn't a chapter, it was a sentence. Once you were labeled the fool, there was no release, no transformation, no retirement plan nestled at the edge of the kingdom. You were not allowed to evolve. The hat didn't come off. Other men aged into respect, became merchants, monks, advisors, elders. You aged into exhaustion, into ridicule, into invisibility. As your back curved and your wit slowed, they didn't call you master or lord. They still called you fool, but with less patience, less laughter, more disgust. You became the thing they had outgrown, an embarrassment that once brought joy. You might once have spoken 3 languages, written clever verse, or understood the rhythms of diplomacy better than the stewards who sat in council. None of that mattered. You could have predicted war, cautioned the king, offered insight that might have spared blood and coin. But they wouldn't hear it, not from you. They heard the bells first. They saw the costume. Your intelligence had been camouflaged too well. You might have been more brilliant than half the court, but no one would admit it. Because the jester was never meant to shine. You were there to sparkle just enough to distract, never enough to dazzle. If your performance surpassed the nobleman's joke, it was considered insolence. If your song outshone the baron's toast, you were called arrogant. You had to strike a cruel balance, brilliant but never threatening, clever but never commanding. You were allowed to juggle knives but never wield them. And if you tried to leave, the world outside wouldn't receive you as a man who had spent years surviving the court's psychological crucible. They'd see only the mask. You didn't own land. You had no trade, no place among guilds or clergy. You had stories about duchesses and generals, but outside castle walls, those stories made you sound mad, not seasoned. You'd walk into town dressed in frayed velvet, muttering about politics and betrayal, and they'd mistake you for a vagrant, a washed-up performer who had wandered too far from the fair. If you vanished, the court wouldn't search. They would shrug. They would simply find another, because you weren't remembered. You were replaced, and so most jesters stayed. They stayed until they could no longer speak, no longer dance, no longer summon the energy to joke at their own expense. Because the fear of obscurity was worse than the humiliation of endurance. Better to be a fading laugh in the corner of power than silence in the wilderness. Better, perhaps, to be forgotten slowly than all at once. In the grand halls of power, you were the only one allowed to speak truth, but only if you disguised it well enough to be ignored. Everyone else wore masks of politeness, cloaks of protocol, diplomats flattered, courtiers schemed. Even servants bent their words around fear. But you could say what others dared not because they thought you were harmless. Or rather, they hoped you were. You could joke about the king's disastrous tax policies. You could impersonate the duchess's lover. You could even whisper something dangerously close to dissent, so long as it arrived wrapped in rhymes and performed with a somersault. They'd laugh loudly, nervously, pretending it was just a jest. But beneath the chuckles, something always stirred. Because the truth, even told in bells and riddles, had weight. One sharp pun about a bishop's appetite could shake the foundation of a court's illusion. A clever verse about a failing war campaign could spread like wildfire, whispered from mouth to mouth, until it became something dangerous. And you knew it. That was the real game, delivering truths in absurdity, balancing satire so finely that it cut deep without leaving visible wounds. But you also knew this. If your wit ever pierced too deep, if your meaning ever became too clear, the same people who once clutched their sides in laughter would point fingers in fury. The line you walked between clown and criminal, between fool and prophet, was thinner than a hair, and it moved constantly. One day the queen would laugh at your barb about her cousin's gambling. The next, that same cousin would be at dinner, and suddenly you'd committed a political offense. One week, your mockery of a noble's fifth marriage would earn applause. The next, it would be called an attack on the sanctity of aristocracy. What saved you yesterday could condemn you today. So you learned the art of shadows, of hiding meaning in metaphor, of couching warning in whimsy. You might say, the rooster with no eggs should crow less at dawn, and hope the king took it as a joke about a rival lord rather than a warning about treason. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he stared, and in those moments your pulse ticked like a drum, waiting to see if you crossed a line no one had drawn. There was no safety net, no rank to protect you. You were not noble, not soldier, not priest. You were the court's voice of disruption, tolerated only as long as you kept the chaos amusing. But the second your truth stripped away the mask of ceremony, if you ever reminded them too clearly of their hypocrisy, their greed, their fear, the room would turn. The guards would come, and no one would speak in your defense. You lived surrounded by people, nobles, knights, musicians, scribes, and servants, and yet your loneliness was unmatched. You stood in the center of celebration, your voice echoing through great halls, your laughter bouncing off golden goblets and marble columns. You joked at weddings, you danced at births, you even performed at funerals. And yet, when your own time came, no one was there. There was no eulogy for the fool. You didn't receive a grand procession or a carved tombstone. You died, perhaps in a dim, forgotten chamber tucked between the pantry and the servants' latrine. Alone, quietly, maybe even while the court was still laughing at the next feast, unaware that the bells had stopped jingling for good. And if someone did notice, it would have been an afterthought. The cook grumbling that the jester hadn't shown up to dinner, or a stable boy stumbling over your shoes left beside a cold bedroll. There were no heirs to mourn you. You never married. You owned nothing. You left no scrolls behind, no estate, no bloodline. The closest you had to legacy was the memory of your voice echoing in laughter, a sound that vanished as quickly as it came. Maybe years later, a new fool found your old hat buried in a drawer. Maybe someone said, there was another jester once. What was his name again? And no one could remember. You were not recorded in the court chronicles. You were not etched into history like the knights or the poets or the traders. You were a noise, a burst of color, a flicker of distraction. And once you were gone, the silence returned as if you had never been there at all. The irony was cruel. You had lived to give others joy, to ease their fears, to mask their failures. You absorbed the court's tension and made it palatable. You carried the weight of their moods on your back. You made kings forget their burdens, made lords drop their pride. And yet when your own candle finally guttered and went out, the room did not darken. No one noticed. No one paused. Laughter had been your currency, your shield, your leash. And in the end, it was the very thing that ensured your disappearance. Because laughter is fleeting. It doesn't last. And when it fades, so too does the one who delivered it. To the nobles who watched you caper across marble floors and flick roast goose from your sleeves, you were merely a spectacle, an instrument of levity in a world built on titles and tension. But if they had looked closer, truly looked, they might have seen something else. Not just a man spinning jokes in the shadow of thrones, but something stranger, something older. A mirror. You weren't simply there to amuse. You were there to reveal. Every pun you made about the Baron's fifth wife hinted at his desperation. Every limping impression of the war minister raised questions no one dared to ask aloud. You danced, yes, but your dance was subversion, a spinning commentary on power's absurdity. And with every line, every chuckle you pulled from a tense room, you forced them to squirm. Because somewhere beneath the slapstick, there was always a needle. A truth, that was the jester's gift and his curse. You could point out what others would never voice. The hypocrisy, the injustice, the emptiness behind the gold-leafed grandeur, but you had to do it while smiling. You had to wrap your insight in a silly voice, or else they'd call it insolence. You were allowed to expose the emperor's nakedness, but only if you did it while juggling eggs and blowing raspberries. That was the deal. Make them laugh. Never make them flinch too hard. Because the moment they realized the fool understood too much, that the man in motley grasped the whole damn game, the joke was over. And so were you. So you kept the act alive. You whispered truth, but you did it softly. You mocked, but with a twist of charm. You mirrored back the court's own grotesqueness, but always through the funhouse lens. Because they needed you, even if they hated what you showed them. And sometimes, though they'd never admit it, they feared you. But they never feared you for long. Because in the end, no matter how sharp your words, you were still the one in bells. Still the one dancing. Still the one made to vanish when the curtain fell. And as the centuries passed, they remembered the kings, the battles, the treaties, the wars. But not the fool. His name faded. His stories crumbled. Only the echo of laughter remained, and no one thought to ask who had first told the joke. Once you wore the jester's hat, it never truly came off. It clung to your skin like a second soul, a brand that no wash nor prayer could remove. Long after your voice grew hoarse, after your steps lost their spring, after your jokes failed to rise above a whisper, you were still the fool. Not a man, not a citizen, just a relic, a noise from another room. And for those few who lived long enough to age in their role, the decay was slow and merciless. Your teeth dulled. Your hands shook. The laughter grew thinner, more strained. Eventually, the nobles looked at you not with delight, but pity, perhaps even irritation. You had outlived your charm, outlasted your use. They might replace you with a younger fool, someone leaner, stranger, more amusing. Or worse, they'd keep you around as a walking ghost, a hollow mascot mumbling broken rhymes in a voice nobody cared to hear. Still you stayed, because where else could you go? You had no land to return to, no family waiting by the hearth, no skill outside of this one twisted craft. You couldn't farm, you weren't trained to trade. Even your speech, sharpened through metaphor, riddles, and mimicry, made you sound more mad than wise in the eyes of villagers. Outside the castle, your history unraveled. In the streets of the nearest town, you were just a disheveled man in outdated colors, muttering about princes and scandals. They didn't see a performer. They saw a lunatic. And if by some miracle you escaped the palace, wandered far enough, maybe found work helping at a tavern or reciting tales to wide-eyed children, it wouldn't last. Sooner or later, a letter would arrive. Or a noble would pass through and remember your face. "Where has the old fool gone?" they'd ask. "Fetch him back, he made us laugh." And they would, because to them you were not a person, you were a sound they remembered. A thing that made the wine taste richer and the world feel a little less serious for a moment. A tool, a noise, a jingle at the edge of memory, and when they called, you came. You always came, not out of loyalty, out of necessity, because you were the jester. And once you were the jester, you were the jester forever. In a room filled with swords, scrolls, and scepters, the man in bells might have been the only one who could speak freely, at least on the surface. The irony was sharp. You had no title, no lands, no noble blood. And yet there were moments, brief and brittle, where you said aloud what others only dared to think. You could mock the king's paranoia. You could joke about the taxes crushing the peasants or imitate the general who lost half the army in a botched campaign. You said these things not because you were fearless, but because you had been given a strange sort of license, not to rule, not to act, but to speak. Carefully, always carefully. Because everyone laughed as if it were just a jest, but you knew and they knew that it wasn't. Your humor was the sugar coating. Inside was something bitter, a truth they needed but couldn't tolerate in any other form. So you kept your voice light, your metaphors colorful. You turned rumors into riddles, corruption into comedy, and scandal into slapstick. That was how you survived, how you spoke honestly in a world built on lies. But survival was not the same as safety, because the room only tolerated the truth until it cut too deep. One clever jab too many, one name spoken too clearly, and the same court that once howled with laughter would fall silent, not because they disapproved of your insight, but because you reminded them that you saw, that you understood, and no one wanted the fool to understand. The crown might smile one day and order your execution the next. A noble might chuckle at your satire in public, then send a servant to poison your cup in private. You were never above suspicion, never beyond punishment. In fact, you were more vulnerable than anyone. Because once the court decided you were no longer amusing or worse, too aware, there would be no trial, no appeal, just silence. And still you spoke. Because that was the job, not just to entertain but to reveal. And maybe in some hidden part of yourself you wanted them to hear it, even if it meant risking everything. You spent your life surrounded by laughter, but you died in silence. That was the jester's final punchline, not cruel, not surprising, just inevitable. The great halls that once rang with your jokes would carry on without you. Feasts would still be held, cups raised, new fools hired, and you would vanish without ceremony. There would be no funeral procession, no mournful ballads, no eulogies spoken over your resting place, because you were never meant to be remembered. That had always been part of the design. You were not written into history books or knighted posthumously. You were the background, the filler, the noise that made the world feel lighter for a time. And when the laughter stopped, so did you. Maybe, if you were lucky, someone in the kitchens would whisper your name once or twice in the weeks that followed. Remember the old jester, they might say. The one who danced like his knees were made of string, and someone else would nod. But the memory would fade before the wine soured, and your bells, if they were found at all, would be passed to another or thrown into a drawer and forgotten. You had no heirs, no portraits, no relics. Even your grave, if you had one, was likely dug in unblessed earth, far from the churchyard. Fools, after all, were not considered sacred. You told too many jokes and said too few prayers. You lived in service of others' joy, and in the end not one of them came to grieve. Your candle went out and no one noticed the dark. You left no legacy, no family crest, just silence. And perhaps in the distance a single fading jingle. To the court you were a fool. But you were also something far stranger, a contradiction draped in color. You stood at the heart of ceremony, spinning and jesting beneath vaulted ceilings, surrounded by velvet and armor and gold. You were mocked. You were feared. You were laughed at. But you were also, in a way, revered not as a man but as a symbol. Because the jester did more than amuse. He exposed. You could say things no priest would dare. You could call out hypocrisy not with a sword or sermon, but with a grin. Your mimicry was a scalpel, your wordplay a whispering rebellion. You made them laugh, yes, but you also made them uncomfortable, because in every joke was a mirror. And sometimes the room saw too much of itself in your reflection. That's why they kept you close. Not just to entertain, but to remind. to be the one creature in that rigid, ordered world who could be unpredictable, uncontrolled, necessary. You were lowborn, but you could mock kings. Powerless, yet you told the truth. Dressed in rags, but holding a sharper insight than any knight's blade. You were the exception to every rule, and that made you dangerous and vital, because the jester, at his core, wasn't just there to play. He was there to reveal what the kingdom most feared, that beneath the crowns and rituals and silks, they were all still human, fallible, ridiculous. You were the only one allowed to point at the mighty and laugh. And for that they needed you, until they didn't. And when they didn't, the joke was no longer on them. It was on you. You were the echo they never wanted to hear again until they needed you. And then, like a worn glove pulled from a dusty drawer, you were summoned, shaken out, expected to fit. You had lived a life poured out for their joy, and in the end, that very joy became the reason you were forgotten. Your story, if told at all, lived in fragments, in the margins of a steward's journal, in the footnotes of a bishop's sermon. No full chronicle bore your name, no bard sang your life. You were a line, not a legacy, a whisper in a room once full of laughter. And yet something remains. You stood on the edge of power and peril. You survived in a place where silence meant death and speech could kill. You spun wit into armor, wrapped pain in parody. And you endured. You endured not because they valued you, but because you were willing to let them laugh at your soul just to buy one more day. That was the cruelest art. Not the juggling, not the mimicry, not even the rhyme. It was the performance of invisibility, the trick of disappearing behind the sound of your own voice. They feared that you understood them. They laughed harder when you failed. But in those failures you gave them exactly what they wanted, proof that you were never more than a fool. And still, you knew better. You were never just a clown in a hat. You were witness to power, to cruelty, to truth no one dared name. And though they tried to bury your name beneath feasts and politics and records of kings, they could not bury your function. Because every palace needs a fool, not for amusement, but for balance. And you, with your bells and broken smile, were the only one who ever dared to say what they all refused to hear. Long after the firelight faded from the stone walls, after the laughter grew stale and the feast tables were cleared, what remained of you was not your name, but the shadow of your role. You had been the fool, the voice that echoed truths in rooms that punished honesty, the face that smiled when no one else dared, not out of joy, but survival. You were never celebrated like the generals or remembered like the kings. But without you, those great halls would have collapsed under the weight of their own silence. You were the pressure valve, the relief, the distraction, the one who absorbed everything that others could not admit. And even though they forgot your face, your shape lingered. You haunted the corridors in the form of every laugh that came too quickly, every performance that concealed a wound. Because you weren't just a man in bells. You were a system, a symbol, a message that the court itself refused to read aloud. That power needs someone beneath it to feel tall. That cruelty needs laughter to mask its teeth. That the most dangerous truths are the ones told in jest. Centuries later, scholars might stumble upon a record, a coin etched with a smirking face, a marginal note in a noble's diary referencing a joke that once made the court uneasy. They might ask, who was he? What did he say? Why did it matter? And maybe, just maybe, they'll realize the truth. The jester was never the joke. He was the reminder that when kings forget their humanity, someone must dare to make them laugh and bleed in the same breath. You were never meant to survive the telling. That was part of the pact. The jester who endures becomes dangerous. So you were designed to vanish, your legacy dissolved in the echo of laughter you created. The court devoured your genius and spat out your name. And in doing so, they buried something sacred, the memory of a man who told the truth through mockery, who held a flickering lantern in a palace built on shadow. But the embers never fully die. Somewhere, buried beneath centuries of genealogies and battle maps, your story lingers. Not as a complete tale, but in slivers. A satire recorded by a monk who didn't understand its edge. A faded manuscript scribbling about a fool who once made the queen weep with laughter and the king go cold with fury. A rumor passed down in the kitchens about a jester who said too much and then disappeared. And that is how truth survives in a world that tried to erase it. You were born into a structure designed to keep people in their place. Yet you moved through it, mocked it, twisted it. You were a man forced to be ridiculous just to stay alive. And in doing so, you became the only one who could say what no one else dared. Your legacy isn't in the records, it's in the warning. Because even now, in every modern hall of power, there is still a role like yours. Someone expected to keep things light, to absorb discomfort, to be laughed at instead of listened to. The costume may have changed. The bells may have gone silent, but the function remains, and so does the danger. Because when truth returns dressed in humor, people laugh until it hits too close. Then they scramble to silence the messenger. But by then, it's too late. The truth has already landed, just as you once intended. Long before curtains rose and actors bowed, theater began not in silence, but in song, in wine, in trance. It was not invented by men seeking applause. It was summoned by gods who demanded devotion. In ancient Greece, performance was not entertainment, it was worship. Theater did not emerge from a stage, it was born from ritual, from the pulsing, ecstatic celebrations of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, fertility, and divine chaos. In 6th century Athens, the city transformed each spring into a living altar. The festival of Dionysia turned streets into processions, temples into stages, citizens into performers. Livestock was sacrificed, wine flowed freely, and in the center of the chaos, something miraculous happened. People began to become others. Men donned masks and voices not their own. They didn't act, they transformed. It began with the dithyramb, a choral hymn of 50 men chanting, swaying, eyes wide, movements wild. They spoke as one. They were not characters, they were vessels. A single body made of many throats, each word a vibration carried on wind and incense. They didn't pretend, they channeled, and then something changed. A man stepped out from the chorus, alone, speaking not as himself but as someone else. His name, legend says, was Thespis. And with that step, with that simple act of I am not me, acting as we understand it was born. That is why we still call performers thespians, to remember the moment one voice dared to stand apart from the chorus of many. That first step became a structure. Ritual became drama. Soon, poets like Aeschylus and Sophocles shaped the chaos into form. One actor became two, then three. The chorus shrank, but the stories grew. Tragedy was born, and with it came gods, heroes, vengeance, and fate. Greek tragedies weren't simply plays. They were collisions of myth and morality, played out beneath the sky in open-air theaters carved into hillsides. The audience wasn't passive. They were witnesses. They were part of the ritual. The theater of Dionysus in Athens held thousands. Rows upon rows of stone, curved like a bowl to catch every sound, every scream, every whispered confession. Masks were worn not just for anonymity, but for amplification, giant, stylized expressions that could be read from the last seat in the last row. One actor could become many, switching roles with each mask, each change of stance, each transformation of voice. They didn't seek realism. They sought revelation. The Greeks didn't see theater as pastime. They saw it as a civic duty, a spiritual confrontation. When the city gathered in the open air beneath the sun, they weren't simply spectators. They were participants in a collective reckoning. These were not nights of idle amusement. These were rituals of truth, grief, and the fragile thread of being human beneath the gaze of the gods. And at the core of that ritual was tragedy. They called it tragedia, goat song, though no one can say exactly why. Perhaps it harkened back to the sacrifice of goats at Dionysian festivals. Or maybe, more symbolically, it captured the haunting bleat of mortality in a world ruled by fate. What mattered more than the name was the weight of the form. Greek tragedies didn't pull punches. They opened wounds. These plays spoke of fathers murdering sons, sons killing fathers, daughters burying brothers, kings blinded by pride, queens torn apart by vengeance. No topic was too sacred, no flaw too human. And in the center of it all stood the masked actors, echoing across time and stone. They didn't act so much as embody. Their movements were ritual, their voices thunder, their presence myth. The greatest tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, each shaped this storm into structure. Aeschylus brought the second actor. Sophocles added the third. Euripides shattered the gods and cracked the human soul wide open. His characters bled, not just with daggers but with doubt. Medea, who kills her children. Orestes, who is driven mad. Antigone, who defies death itself in the name of justice. Yet even in their sorrow, these plays were not grim. They were a cleansing, a catharsis, a way to look grief and terror in the face and find something sacred in the gaze. The Greeks believed that by confronting darkness, the city could be purified. And so they gathered day after day, performance after performance, to weep together under the same sky. And when the tears dried, they laughed. Because after tragedy came its unruly sibling, comedy. And it wasn't gentle. Where tragedy searched for meaning in suffering, Greek comedy tore off the mask and laughed at the gods themselves. If tragedy asked why fate was cruel, comedy barked back, "Why is Zeus such a pompous fool?" It was theater with no breaks, no reverence, no fear. It mocked war, politicians, philosophers, even the audience, especially the audience. This was the domain of Aristophanes. His plays were fire disguised as farce. In one, women end a war by refusing to sleep with their husbands. In another, Socrates is lampooned as an absurd, sky-gazing fraud. In yet another, dead poets argue in the underworld while frogs sing from the orchestra pit. It was ridiculous and brilliant. The masks of comedy were grotesque, exaggerated, huge eyes, distorted faces, swollen bodies. Every gesture was oversized, every joke delivered at full volume. The costumes were absurd, often padded and equipped with exaggerated anatomy. The chorus didn't just sing, it flapped, squawked, clucked, hissed. One play featured a chorus of clouds, another of sausages. But beneath the nonsense, the message was sharp. Aristophanes used humor to eviscerate hypocrisy, to challenge the state, to question morality. He made the city laugh but made sure they squirmed while doing it. And he wasn't alone. Comedy became the satirical mirror tragedy dared not hold. It poked and prodded and exposed, hiding dangerous ideas behind fart jokes and pratfalls. It was still sacred, part of the same festivals that honored Dionysus. But it was the sacred turned upside down. The theater was no longer a place to seek divine order. It was where humans mocked their own absurdity, and through that mockery, discovered something dangerously close to truth. When the sun rose over Athens, and the city gathered in stone theaters to weep over Antigone's defiance or Oedipus's doom, it was tragedy that held their breath. But when the tears dried and the masks were swapped for laughter, it was comedy that reminded them to breathe again, to laugh, even while the city groaned beneath the weight of politics and war. Comedy came after tragedy, not just in sequence but in spirit. One purified, the other provoked, and both somehow healed. Eventually the form softened. The sharp satire of Aristophanes gave way to domestic farce and gentle mockery. Romance entered the stage, mistaken identities, clever slaves, love-struck daughters. The world of new comedy arrived more polite, less dangerous. The jokes no longer threatened power, they distracted from it. And yet, the bones of Greek theater, its rhythm, its structure, its insistence on performance as mirror, survived. In amphitheaters carved into cliffs and echoing across hillsides, the stage was never just a platform. It was a threshold between gods and mortals, between chaos and order, between mask and face, between the world as it was and the world as it might be, if only for the length of a single, sacred performance.